Аз се казвам Богомил Манчев и съм председател на Българския атомен форум. Опитахме се с колегите да направим тези 4 вебинара, с които да разясним различни неща, които са свързани с изграждане на нови ядрени мощности и не на последно место цялата инфраструктура, която касае хора, техника, науката, управление на знанията и всички тези процеси, които са необходими, за да се поддържа ядрена технология, която имаме, да я удължаваме ресурса максимално, която е позволено от нейните технически качества и възможности, тъй като тя дава най-дългосрочно и най-евтината енергия от нея може да получим от реактори второ поколение, както ние удължихме в България от ресурса на 5 и 6 енергоблок. И естествено, в смисъла на зелената сделка, за да стигнем до 50-та година, България по виждането на Българския атомен форум трябва да изгради до 50-та година има 4 ядрени блока по 1000 мегавата нови, които са разпределени във времето по двойки. Естествено, тъй като в България има 2 ядрени площадки, едната се казва Белене, другата се казва АЕЦ Козлодуй 2, където могат да се изградат по 2 ядрени блока от всеки с мощност по 1000 мегавата. И днес сме стигнали до последния 4-ти вебинар, до най-сложната точка. Значи тя е и правна, и финансова, и двете са толкова сложни, че ако не им обърнем внимание на време, никога няма да може да направим атомна енергетика и атомна централа, а дори няма да си запазим тази, като имаме. Това са моите няколко думи за встъпване и да давам думата на Милко да обяви кой какво ще говори и кога. И аз ще бъда много внимателен слушател. Благодаря ви.
Благодаря на Богомил Манчев, председател на Българския атомен форум, които спонсорират тези 4 вебинара. Както той обясни, до сега бяха проведени 3 с различна тематика. Можете да се запознаете с тях, тъй като записите са представени на страницата на Булатом, както и с публикации в пресата. Това е 4-тият вебинар, който е на тема финансиране на нови ядрени централи. Разбира се, тази серия от вебинари, организирани от Булатом, има за цел по-скоро да оживи дискусията сред българската общественост. Имаме присъстващи около 100 регистрирани към настоящият вебинар и надявам се те всички активно да участват в този вебинар, където по-скоро е един дискусионен форум. Аз се радвам да приветствам тук представители на Форатом, които вече се наричат Nuclear Europe. Наскоро се ребрандираха, госпожа Берта Пикамел, Юлиан Желязков, който дълго време работи по въпросите на финансиране на ядрени проекти в България и извън България. Водещи юристи като Джордж Форвас от Хантън и Елина Теплински от Пилсбери, които активно работят в областта на структуриране и финансиране на ядрени проекти по света. И искам да приветствам особено Мишел Бартелеми, който е от Атомната агенция към Организацията за икономическо сътрудничество и развитие, организация, към която България се присъедини неотдавна, през миналата година, и Алиша Дънкън, която е председател на ИФНЕК, което е Международния форум за сътрудничество в областта на ядрената сфера. С това представяне на днешните панелисти, аз бих искал да преминем към същността. Самият вебинар ще протече под формата на няколко встъпителни изказвания, а в последствие ще има диалог както с нашите участници, така и с публиката, като се надявам също така от външните участници да бъдат активни, да допринесат активно с въпроси за успеха на този вебинар. Мой партньор при модерирането ще бъде Петър Манчев. За съжаление, предварително обявеният модератор отпадна към момента. И така, с тези входящи думи, I would like to ask everyone, do you hear well the translation, just to check technicalities in advance?
Yes.
Good here.
Very good, thank you. So we will move in Bulgarian further. И така, бих искал първо да дам думата на Юлиан Желязков. Юлиане, дали искаш да споделиш с нас на базата на твоя опит какви са основните рискове, които едни големи инвестиционни проекти проявяват и в каква степен тези рискове могат да бъдат управлявани. България прави опити за разширяване на своята ядрена програма отдавна, неуспешни. И може би този вебинар е много важен към момента, за да може да стъпим на здрава основа за бъдещото развитие. Бих искал да спомена, че за съжаление вчера в българския парламент беше гласуван вод на недоверие на българското правителство и към момента има неяснота от гледна точка на политическия риск за всякакви инициативи, но надявам се в рамките на този вебинар да имаме възможност да се дистанцираме от конкретиката и да разгледаме международният опит в тази област. Заповядай, Юлиане.
Благодаря, Милко. Добър ден на всички. Благодаря за оказаната възможност да участвам в този вебинар. И независимо от новината, която току-що съобщи, макар че тя е изключително важна в контекста на финансирането на каквито и да инфраструктурни проекти в България, не само на ядрени централи, ще се опитам да започна малко по-шеговито, тъй като, както и ти сам каза, България има дълъг опит с опита за финансиране на ядрени мощности в България, който най-общо казано мога да определя шеговито с един израз, който децата много обичат, когато чукат на вратите по времето на си свети, т.е. срещу 1 ноември, който се нарича трикортрет, или най-общо преведено на българския именно лакомство или пакост. Лакомството определено финансирането на ядрени централи е лакомство за всяка една държава, но в същото време, както се оказва, и може да нанесе голяма пакост или най-малкото голяма вреда или голяма заплаха, в случай, че финансирането не бъде намерено или че същото не бъде поддържано по време на изпълнението на проекта. България реално през последните 20 години опита почти всички добре познати и добре издържани в световен мащаб варианти за финансиране. И ако ги разделим най-общо казано на три основни възможности, а именно финансиране на база на баланс на собственика или balance sheet financing, on-balance sheet financing, минем през проектно финансиране и минем през финансиране правителство спрямо правителство. Съществуващите две площадки, както сподели господин Манчев в България, дружеството Нови мощности вече навърши 10 години, а проекта Белене има над 30 годишна история. През времето на своите съществувания, първоначално финансирането в България беше търсено като вариант на проектно финансиране. Т.е. търсене на чуждестранен партньор, който да притежава определено акционерно участие в капитала и на база на собствени дългов капитал да бъде финансирана площадка Белене. В течение на времето и предвид намирането и в последствие отказа на инвеститор, през цялото това време всички дейности по проекта, неуспешният проект Белене, както и сегашните дейности по отношение на площадка Козлодуй, се осъществяват единствено и само на база на баланса на собственика. В миналото НЕК, в настоящето на база на баланса на АЕЦ Козлодуй. Беше търсена възможност и така се появи с времето за финансиране също правителство, но тя беше така или иначе отвърлена поради политически причини. Казвайки политически причини и във връзка с поделеното по-рано, политическия риск е може би най-големия риск пред всеки един инвеститор и пред всяка една банка или кредитна институция, която участва под каквато и да е форма в един ядрен проект. Защото държавната подкрепа и то продължителната държавна подкрепа, каквато е нужна за ядрената енергетика, предвид както дългия срок на изграждането на ядрени централи като инфраструктурни проекти, така и можем да си го кажем абсолютно честно, забавите, които кумулират в голямата си част ядрените проекти по света, носят със себе си един огромен риск, който политическото общество, независимо от това кое правителство е на власт, правителствата падат, правителствата идват, тогава този риск, ако не бъде покрит, е ясно, че едно финансиране, за да бъде осигуреното, няма как по никакъв начин да бъде гарантирано през един такъв дълъг срок на инвестицията. Защото приемащата страна, независимо от това дали проектът ще бъде изпълняван от собственик, който е единствено и само регистриран на територията на приемащата страна, или от дружество, което има за съакционери и чуждестранни инвеститори, то трябва при всички положения да бъде гарантирано, че най-малко ще възвърне инвестицията си през срока на работа на централата, а на първо време при всички положения трябва да върне заемните средства по проекта. В предварителните ни разговори много често се задавахме въпроса защо през последните 2 или 3 години в България се наложи мнението, че е възможно финансиране на каквато и да е ядрена мощност. Тук визирам дали става дума за малък, за модулен реактор, дали става дума за 60 или за 1600 мегавата. В крайна сметка от юридическа гледна точка и по отношение на ядрените рискови, по отношение на структурите на проекта и възможностите за привличане на чуждестранно финансиране, рисковете продължават да бъдат едни и същи и невъзможността за осигуряване на гаранции за финансиращите институции от една страна и за евентуални инвеститори в акционерно участие от друга страна, винаги води до няколко неща. Гаранцията е тази, която дава спокойствие и на кредитиращите институции, и на инвеститорите по отношение на развитието на техните проекти, в която и да е държава. И споделеното през последните 2 години мнение в България, че е възможно ние да развиваме ядрена енергетика при условие, че няма да е налице държавна гаранция по проекта, няма да са налице дългосрочни договори по проекта, няма да са налице договори за изкупуване на електрическата енергия по проекта, т.е. абдикирането от една подкрепа, която е изключително важна за финансирането на всеки един проект, води до факта, че е почти невъзможно при наличието на липса на гаранции, при липсата на гаранции финансирането на каквато и да е ядрена мощност в България. Може и да звучи изключително негативно, но няма как да накараме който и да е инвеститор или която и да е банка или финансираща институция да участва в финансирането на една ядрена централа без наличието на гаранции. Дали тези гаранции ще бъдат по отношение на държавата, дали тези гаранции ще бъдат по отношение на акционерите, дали тези гаранции ще бъдат във връзка с финансирането на проекта, то без гаранции и гаранция, казвам в вида, в който много често гаранциите се разглеждат като мръсна дума, като дума, която предполага някакво задължение или задължаване на държавата спрямо трети лица и не гарантиране на националния интерес. Напротив, гарантирането на финансирането на всеки един проект е от ключова важност за неговото развитие. И сега към вас мисля, че направихме някакво встъпление, което да даде възможност на всички участници. В крайна сметка, конкуренцията в ядрената индустрия, в която всички ние работим, е силно ограничена, поради факта, че на пазара реално има 5 големи доставчика, като избора на технология в повечето случаи води до както откриване на източници за финансиране към всеки един от доставчиците, така и от лимитиране на тези източници за финансиране. Защото много често в моя опит с проекти, както в България, така и извън България, много често ми задава въпроса, можем ли да сравним едно финансиране с друго финансиране. И възможностите за едно финансиране с друго финансиране. И много често, имайки предвид размера на инвестицията, сравнението на едно финансиране с друго финансиране е почти невъзможно. Всички сме наясно, че едни от историческите доставчици предпочитат финансиране през държавния бюджет, другите доставчици предпочитат финансиране през експортно-кредитни варианти и през намиране на допълнителни средства през търговски банки. Но самия избор на технология, мисля, че трябва всички да са наясно, че води след себе си лимитиране на източниците за финансиране, а не обратното. Благодаря за момента.
Благодаря, Яне, за тези встъпителни слова, малко за ориентация в българската ситуация. Мисля, че проектите у нас винаги са били за ядрени, нови ядрени мощности, винаги са били свързани с регионална дименсия. Винаги се е говорило за било то изкупуване на енергия от, да кажем, Република Северна Македония, от други страни в региона, напоследък от Гърция. В каква степен това би могло да подпомогне структурирането на един такъв ядрен проект и доколко ядрен проект в България би имал регионално измерение? Разбира се, ние трябва да имаме предвид, че в региона работят други атомни централи, като Черна вода в Румъния, която в момента е готова да бъде разширена с още 2 блока, а също така и Турция прави своите планове за нова площадка непосредствено до границата на България, площадката Егнеада, за строителство на атомна централа. Доколко тези регионални измерения или интерес могат да подпомогнат структурирането на един такъв ядрен проект? И не знам, Юлиане, ако искаш ти вземи думата по този въпрос. Първо, мисля, че и други панелисти ще допълнят това отговор.
Да, нека първо да започна тогава. Наясно сме с регионалния контекст от гледна точка на факта, че идеите, които бяха лансирани преди година и половина, че Република Северна Македония е с интерес да участва в структурирането на един такъв проект. В същия аспект и преди години бяха правени опити, тогава бяха правени процедури с това да се направи един реален пазарен, реално пазарно проучване какво беше търсенето на електроенергия при евентуално финансиране в средата, примерно на предходните 10 години. И въпреки, че е налице изключително огромен интерес, все пак сме наясно, че няма как България да гарантира чисто юридически възможности за пренос през границата предвид участието си в Обединения европейски пазар. Чисто акционерно, да, възможно е за включването на миноритарни акционери при структурирането на един такъв проект, които биха могли да допринесат за неговото финансиране, но нека не забравяме, че подобни намерения бяха на дневен ред и за прибалтийските държави преди 2 или 3 години, възможности за евентуална връзка между Литва, Латвия и Естония и съответно постояние на ядрена централа, но регионален аспект е изключително трудно поради факта, че въпреки всичко приемащата страна, чисто юридическа гледна точка, т.е. страната, на която територия ще бъде изградена ядрената мощност, така или иначе ще носи всички ядрени рискови проекти. Мисля, че и колегата Джордж Бороват също има доста опит в тази насока и също би споделил подобни опасения от чисто юридическа гледна точка.
Благодаря, господин Желязков. Аз мисля да минем нататъка. Сред нас е госпожа Берта Пикамал от Форатом или от Nuclear, както вече се нарича Форатом. Всъщност Булатом е член на Форатом и Форатом е много важна организация на ядрената индустрия на ниво европейски институции, представя идеите на своите членове пред Европейската комисия, пред Европейския парламент и много от дискусиите, свързани включително с финансирането в последните година и половина, две, съдържат думата таксономия. Дума, която поне в български язик като че ли не беше много употребявана до това. Берта, какво е таксономията, тъй като сега има предложение на комисията към Европейския парламент и Европейския парламент се очаква скоро да гласува в началото на юли предложението на комисията. По какъв начин това би влияло на развитието на ядрени проекти в България, не в България, въобще в Европейския съюз? И ако не бъде гласувано от парламента, в каква степен това ще е края на нови ядрени проекти или всъщност те ще могат да продължат да се случват? Берта? I hope my question is clear. No?
Well, thank you very much, Milko, and thank you to our colleagues in Bulatom. It's my pleasure to address you today and to explain a little bit the, how could I put it, the difficulties that we're facing in Brussels to explain the importance of nuclear to really reach the climate goals that the Union has imposed itself. And everything goes back now to this taxonomy. And it is indeed something that nobody knew anything about. And it came, I wouldn't say as a surprise, but as a nightmare at some point in time, because at the very beginning, when we in Foratom/Nuclear Europe started alerting members about taxonomy back in late 2018, so it's more than 3 years ago, most of our colleagues in the nuclear sector and even larger on the energy sector were saying, but this is nothing to do with us. So we had to go back to the basics of what the taxonomy is, what is it intended for, and how it would indeed affect us as many other economic activities in the Union. So basically, and to go back to the roots and as an introductory remarks, the Union proposed, in order to meet the climate and energy targets of 2030, and to reach obviously this so-called European Green Deal and legislation that would help direct investments towards what they call sustainable projects and activities. What is it exactly, the EU taxonomy? So it's basically a classification system that establishes a list of environmentally sustainable economic activities. That is when we had to insist on the fact that electricity production needed to be considered as an economic activity. Therefore, we needed to look into what the dangers could be for our sector in the energy, as in general, in the electricity and in the nuclear. So basically what the European Union is aiming at with the taxonomy is the scaling up the sustainable investments and to implement the European Green Deal. But you all know that the Commission has imposed itself, it has agreed, so member states, that is to say also Bulgaria as a country has agreed to the proposal of the Union as a whole on the targets that need to be reached by 2030 first, and then there's other targets to 2050 at the very latest, but also beyond. So what is it is that we basically intend to decarbonize our whole economy. There was a first regulation that was published in yesterday. It was 2 years since it was published. It was published on the 22nd of June 2020, and it entered into force directly on the 12th of July. But this taxonomy regulation basically also has to be implemented through what we call the delegated acts. There were several that were proposed, or 2 that were proposed, but the one that it's mainly affecting us is the complementary delegated act that was presented by the European Commission in February this year. And in this complementary delegated act, you have 2 specific mentions. One is nuclear, but it comes together with gas energy activities. the law or those instruments cannot be amended. That is to say that the proposal that comes from the European Commission can either be accepted as such or rejected. So if we come to the question of being accepted, and it's unfortunately the case nowadays, member states have to agree to consider both nuclear and gas together as sustainable economic activities. The war in Ukraine has made things more difficult since late February this year, because if we only put it in the context of the discussions today in the taxonomy, most of the member states and even European Parliament members that did not have any problem whatsoever to vote for the inclusion of nuclear and gas in the taxonomy considerations are now thinking it over twice because of the gas and not because of the nuclear. But as I mentioned, it's very important to take into account and to know that both come together. You cannot say, okay, we agree on the nuclear, we want the gas out, or vice versa. This doesn't work. So basically, we're faced now with the situation where the taxonomy complementary delegated act will be either adopted or rejected as a whole. You have probably been following all the discussions about nuclear. Nuclear nowadays, and I would say that since many years now, maybe even decades, is nothing to do with rational. It's a dogmatic approach that most of the people are taking about nuclear. So it's very difficult to get into this more rational discussion about what nuclear does contribute in nowadays goals. But this is what we continue to be doing here in Brussels. I mentioned it before. I don't have the crystal ball. What will happen? This is for the time being very difficult to know. Many have focused on the votes that took place last week in the European Parliament. The complementary delegated act had a motion for a resolution from the European Parliament where two committees, not the plenary, I would like to stress this, two committees voted for the exclusion or for the non-adoption of the complementary delegated act. Excuse me. I think Milko, you're up. Okay. So when I was saying last week in Parliament, it was a difficult discussion, but the outcome was not a surprise to us, taking into account that those two committees that voted, in particular the Environmental Committee, has always been very negative towards nuclear. So as I said, the votes that took place were just no surprise to us. This being said, now this has to go to the plenary. And the plenary will finally decide yes or no, the nuclear has to be put in the taxonomy. The question that was addressed to me when I was invited to this distinguished panel is about what will happen if nuclear is not in. Well, to be honest, if it was already difficult to finance nuclear projects in the past, not being in the taxonomy will probably make it even more difficult. This being said, it will not be impossible, because it's not a prohibition for nuclear projects to be financed because they are not in taxonomy. This is not what it is about, but it will make things even more difficult if they were difficult before. We do see, however, and despite all these discussions that we have had for many months, if not years, that there are a lot of countries that do continue considering nuclear as an option for their own decarbonized targets and to contribute to the EU's decarbonized targets. We do not rule out that nuclear will continue to be. There are many projects, whether it's from large scale nuclear or the small modular reactors or the advanced modular reactors that continue to be part of the discussions in policies within member states at national level, but also in the Union. So somehow this is where the contradiction kicks in, is that discussions in Brussels do continue to consider at least SMRs, maybe, to be seen, to see the light in Europe. So when it comes to discussions that we have with the European institutions, what we always claim is that there needs to be consistency and coherence in policies. From the one side, you cannot impose targets for decarbonizing the economy of the Union if we do not give the means to member states to do so in an easy manner. And it has been proven and accepted and put forward by the European Commission itself. Nuclear is part of the decarbonized program. Let's say that back in 2018, late 2018, this 2050 roadmap was saying that at least 15% of the electricity produced in the Union should come from nuclear, as this famous sentence from the European Commission saying that nuclear together with RES, or I would say the other way around, renewable energy sources together with nuclear was the backbone of the decarbonized economy in 2050 for the Union. So with this, I would finalize my introductory remarks saying that we do need nuclear, and the European Union has to give its means to be able to finance them. But everything also goes back to the question of taxonomy.
Thank you, Berta. Very insightful and very clear message. Indeed, you mentioned that, if I can summarize at the end of the day, consistency of national and European policies should be aligned because in addition to the climate objectives that you very clearly spelled out, the current situation drives back on the top of the agenda security of supply considerations, and certainly nuclear can reach both objectives very effectively, climate and security of supply objectives, as we can see. For example, in Bulgaria, 70% of the low carbon electricity is offered by nuclear. So you see that it is a significant contributor to. With this, I would like to, извинявайте за английски, с това искам да прехвърля топката към моя модератор Петър за по-нататък да води разговора. Петре, имаш дума.
Благодаря, Милко. Чухме до сега как ние в България сме опитали различни, почти всички познати конфигурации, варианти за финансиране, без особен успех до момента. Същевременно новите рамки, които чертае Европейския съюз чрез таксономията, виждаме, че не е ясно доколко помагат, може би по-скоро създават нови предизвикателства. И все пак трябва да има формула на успеха. Господин Боровас, каква е тя? Каква е проектната структура? Какво е разпределението на рисковете, което би в настоящата среда дало предпоставки за един балансирани договори и успешен проект в края на краищата?
Thank you very much for the question, Petra. And obviously, first of all, very excited and honored to be part of this panel in this event. I think that the topics are extremely topical. They're extremely current. As you know, we had a great presentation from Berta now about the EU taxonomy issue. We see the stakes. This is about the future of Europe, future of a lot of countries. So I think that the paths that countries will follow in the next few years are going to be determinative on issues of security of supply, as Milko said, climate change. And these are important matters that we should be looking at rationally and not through dogma, just like Berta was mentioning before. Just to answer your more specific question about project structures, I have a short presentation that I want to present a little bit with a few slides that talks about risk allocation that I think answers the broader question about how do you want to approach a nuclear project. If I may bring up that presentation, I'll share my screen. Okay, just to confirm, better, you can see my screen now? Great. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. So, first of all, about the issue about financing, and this is about financing strategies, that in our world today of 2022, you cannot go to the shelf and see, here is a model on financing project, nuclear project. There is no such model, okay? There's different ways of doing it. There's different ways that have been successful. There have been challenges. So there's no actual model that one can just say, here's how we're going to do it. And this is a big difference between nuclear and other forms of energy. You take the IPP projects around the world. If you take the renewables, I mean, there's formulas that have been developed. They can just be replicated over and over again. Nuclear is tough. So it requires much more support and much more thinking. There's no significant multilateral support currently, although there is an effort underway to see if we can fix that. So when I say multilateral, I mean, I talk about international financial institutions like the World Bank or EBRD, which these institutions traditionally do not finance new nuclear projects. So solutions are sought anchored around export credit agencies, like US Exim in the United States, like KEXIM in Korea, JBIC in Japan, and others around the world. So we're trying to come up with different models that fit in the different projects, depending on the fundamentals of each of the projects. But irrespective of whatever you do, there's no question that government support is required. It is necessary, and it is a must in whatever form that takes, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit more. When you're looking at financing, though, the first thing you want to think about is the way that banks think about it. And banks think about risk. That's what they do. They look at risk, they try to minimize it, and they certainly are not willing to accept any, right? They look at all the risk matrix, and they say, who's accepting this risk, who's accepting that risk, and they don't see any risk that they're accepting because that's not their business. Their business is to lend money to invest. It's not to accept nuclear project risk. So the developers have to think about that. How do you minimize the risk of a nuclear project? First of all, you have to worry about the safety culture, mostly important because in its absence, regulators will delay projects, and that's going to be detrimental to any project. Then about the issue of design, and this is something that we've seen over and over and over again, where projects start and say, well, we've selected this technology, and you say, great, let's start. And like, well, we haven't really done the detailed design of the technology, so we have to do a lot more work in the next 2 years in order to give you what you want. That's not a good way to start a project. So having a complete detailed design with a recently constructed reference plant using a proven supply chain and construction team is the best way to minimize your risk. Do this, replicate something that's happened before. I mean, this is basic understanding. Like when you do something in your house, if you're going to construct something in your house, if you've done this before, you know how to do it, you know which contractor to use, you know the cost, you know the issues. If you do it for the first time, it's always much, much more difficult. Then it's the issue about vendor management. You want to have a vendor that has an integrated project delivery team with key personnel experience in building nuclear power projects and experienced subcontractor networks. I've seen in many nuclear projects where you get a project manager and the project manager doesn't have much experience in building nuclear projects. We've seen people that have been involved in operations of nuclear power plants, but that's a completely different industry. Operations and construction are two different industries. So you want to have people that have actually done this before. Owner management, very important. owner experiencing and managing large construction projects, because fundamentally this is always going to be something that the owner is going to be responsible for. And no matter how much risk you shift to the vendor, it is your project. This is who has to lead this. But in that context, there's something that's called project management, which is the best way to manage the risk and minimize the risk in between the owner and the vendor. This is not about risk shifting. I hear this many times, like, oh, let's have a very strong contract. We're going to throw all the risk to the vendor. They're going to accept all the risk. I don't care. This is a turnkey. So therefore, it's not my problem. That's not reality. This is not how reality works. This is your problem as the owner. You cannot shift the risk, even if you can do it contractually and legally. From a project point of view, you do not want to do that. You want to work collaboratively with your vendor in order to minimize the risk, because minimizing the risk is good for the vendor, is good for the owner. So one project manager that I know well that has built nuclear power plants around the world, he describes this as saying that the best way to do this is for the owner to exercise hands-off leadership. And what that means is that you let the vendor do what they know how to do best, but in the end of the day, you have to lead them, but without interfering into their business. It's a delicate balance. It's not easy to do, but it certainly is the right balance in my experience. So you get into this owner-vendor partnership and teamwork, and that's the best way to go, Peter, to your question. This is the best structure in order to do this. Look at this from a partnership point of view. This must be a win-win. You cannot have a situation where this is a good deal for the vendor or a good deal for the owner, and it's a bad deal or a bankruptcy for the other side. It doesn't work. You need it to be a good deal for both sides. So the contracts need to reflect this kind of relationship, and the reality has to reflect this kind of relationship. Then, looking at other lessons learned, regulatory process and interface, having a clear and established interface mechanism with the regulator, understanding how the regulator works, understanding what they're going to do, how much time they're going to take, what kind of information they're going to need, making sure that the regulator has the capacity and the capability to fulfill this function, because sometimes, especially in countries that don't have nuclear power plants, we see regulators that are thinly staffed, that are relying on TSOs, technical support organizations, and sometimes they're unable to make these decisions. The other thing, of course, is to look how you're going to incorporate the country of origin licensing. Of course, the licensing issue is a very, very important sovereign function, and we always have to be remembering that. But at the same time, you don't want to be reinventing the wheel all the time. If 2 or 3 other countries have licensed a nuclear reactor, well, there's probably things that you can start looking at and relying on. Finally, host government and export government supporting structures. This is a collaboration between countries, companies. It's a partnership. You have to have the government supporting them in traditional ways, but in my view, in less traditional ways now. We need governments to actually be more active in order to help us develop our nuclear projects. And finally, human resources development, which is a long lead item. I mean, I cannot stress that enough. It's like you need a long time to develop the right resources for your nuclear project. And this is something you have to start on very, very early on in a project. So what do really investors care about? I mean, the certainty of revenue generation. In the end of the day, there is one product. When the bank looks at this, they say there's one product. It's going to be power or energy or electricity, but that's it. I mean, the rest is all background noise for the investors, right? All they care about is how much power, how is it going to be produced, at what price? So who's going to be the off-taker? Who's going to buy the power? Will it be the government? Will it be taxpayers? Will it be consumers? Is there going to be a price support from the government? Is there just a free market? So you sell the electricity in the market and whatever you get, you get? Well, that's a really tough thing to tell an investor, that they have to base their investment on what the market is going to look like in 10 years. So this is why you have support structures like in the UK, the contracts for difference or long-term power purchase agreements, in order to create that certainty of revenue. So somebody can just say, okay, I'm going to take some risk up front. I'm going to invest my money, but I know that for the next 20 years, there is some kind of form of guarantee that I'm going to make my money back. Clarity in the role of government. What is it there? I mean, we hear a lot of times about the role of government, but sometimes it's pretty broad. So we want it to be well-defined. Is there any financial responsibility? What about the issue about nuclear liability? Is there a position as a shareholder? Is it a provider of guarantees, debt support? there's different roles government can take. As I mentioned before, responsiveness of the regulatory regime, that's something that all banks look at very, very closely. And is it robust? Is it responsible? Is it predictable? We've always hear about, of course, the regulator being independent, and that is commendable and should be. But at the same time, you want to know what the process is, so you know what kind of process you expect in the future. Reputational concerns are also extremely important for financial institutions, and looking at, talking about long-term waste storage issues, pricing, and planning of environmental issues. Those are important things. So you want to have a project that addresses them, so you can say that this is how we're addressing them, because they have their own criteria on how to invest. And also, there's no question about it that when you talk to most banks and you talk about nuclear, they come with a first reaction is a little bit of concern. They have this idea of nuclear being somehow having a stigma, or that it's bad for the environment, or all these terrible issues, dogmatic issues that Berta was talking about before, that you have to overcome. You have to explain that to them. You have to show them with facts and figures about what it is about nuclear, what it makes it so good, and why is it good for the environment, good for the economy, and all the rest. But you need to overcome all these issues. Then the other big one, of course, is the risk of project management. I mean, we have, unfortunately, many examples of long projects that have taken forever, especially first of a kind. So the construction risk, cost overruns, project delays are things that we have to address up front. The proper allocation of the risk is something that's important. So detailed review of the contracts and how the risk works. And looking at the market risk and the demand for energy that we mentioned before. Also, there's other things like electricity and price support, but exchange rate risk. There are things that are kind of traditional project risks that you find. So what do we mean importance of credit enhancement for investors? I mean, if you look at it from a traditional project finance point of view, and what do I mean by limited recourse or non-recourse financing, which means that you, the investor, look to get your revenues just from the project. You're not looking for support outside. So you say, I can invest in that project and I feel comfortable from that project that I'm going to be able to get repaid without any other support. That is extremely challenging for a nuclear project, at least the ones that we're looking at now, first of a kind projects and things like that. So fundamentally, everybody's looking for some kind of government support in order to make sure that they get their return on their investment. So what kind of support do you mean? Do we see government and cross-border guarantees, right? Subsidies and other type of enhancement, guaranteed power purchase and pricing, agreements to cover the cost of delay arising from government action or inaction. Sometimes governments will take decisions. We saw that in Fukushima, where licensing, was disrupted around the world, and they took action. I mean, that is a risk that government should be able to absorb and explain to an investor. Foreign currency payments and pledging of collateral, such as receivables from government-owned industries, and waste management, things like that. So there's a role for government always to play, and this is things that investors will be looking for in order to enhance the credit of any project. So the role of government is essential because, and this is the reason, the benefits of nuclear energy are sovereign in nature. What do I mean by that? We talked about energy security, security of supply, energy diversification, climate change mitigation, industrial development, promoting higher education, highly trained workforces that nuclear does, promoting research and development. You cannot price these things in a project. What is it? How do you price energy security in a project? You can't. I mean, this is a benefit for society. It's society-wide. It's good for the country. It's good for the economy. We see the repercussions of what's happening today in Europe with the war in the Ukraine and how Europe now is looking to diversify its supply. But nobody could have priced that into a project. So there is a benefit there for governments in society. So governments have to accept that, and also provide support in order to get that benefit. Only governments can properly value these benefits because they're long-term. And that experience shows that no nuclear project will go ahead without significant host government involvement. That has to happen. As we said before, you can have different ways that you have the government supporting long-term power purchase agreements, sovereign guarantees, and investment from governments. Now, But this is an important point here, because we don't want to go the other way. We don't want to go into this side where, okay, nuclear is too difficult. Forget about private industry. Let's just have these big, state-owned enterprises that just build nuclear projects, and that's the way to do it. I don't think that's the right model either, because when you do that, you start looking at, there's a lack of discipline. So the pure reliance on government funding may lead to lack of fiscal discipline, lack of accountability, and inefficiency. Just because somebody says, okay, this is a great political decision, let's go build a nuclear reactor there, and we're just going to absorb the risk. You can do that as a government, but is that the right thing to do? So government funding and support should be seen as a bridge to private sector support, with government support decreasing over time. Governments are there, they have a role, but at some point they should be able to withdraw or lessen their involvement, and private industry should be going in there. Attracting private sector funding requires governments to begin planning and thinking as private investors would. And analyzing nuclear projects based on project financing models does help you identify and mitigate the risk, just like a prudent conservative financial institution would. So when you're looking at a project and say, listen, I'm going to assume this is project finance, and although it's not actually going to be project finance, and you do a project finance analysis, you will see every risk that you have to take care of. And that, by doing that, you're going to analyze the project properly. So you're going to minimize your risk in a better way when you develop your model eventually. So you do have to go back to basics in every project. And I said before, there's no model. And let me give you, this is a real life example where I did talk to a bank who had been asked, commercial bank, had been asked to finance a nuclear project in the tune of multiple billions. This was going to be a huge investment for them. Sophisticated bank, they've done work all over the world. They had not done nuclear. So when we started talking about nuclear, they stopped me and said, George, listen, all that sounds great, but I need to get some fundamentals. And they started saying, can you explain to me, does this country that we're talking about, does it need a nuclear power plant? Basically, can you explain to me why they want to have a nuclear plant? Do they want to have a nuclear power plant? And what does that mean? Do the people want it, or are the people against it? Can they afford it? Can this country afford it? Can we talk about their balance sheet? How much is their sovereign debt? What is the structure? How is their economy doing? How will they pay for it? Can they manage it? Can they support it? So these were the first questions they asked. Very, very basic. It actually struck me because it was so raw and so basic that it was a shock that this is how they were thinking. So then they say, okay, now that we have these answers, they say, now can we explain to my management, how will we build it? Is it going to be a consortium? Is it going to be EPC contract? How it's going to happen? How is it going to be operated? Do they have an operating organization? Where are the human resources? All these kind of things. How will they maintain it in the long term? Great, it's operating, but there's long-term maintenance agreements and all these things. Can they continue generating the power in order for me to get repaid? How will the decommissioning eventually clean up the site from a reputational point of view? So with these questions, and I'm serious, this is how we started the project. We started from these 5 questions. Eventually, we ended up with a 30-page term sheet, a 30-page spreadsheet, which identified every risk that we could potentially think about. But it started from these basic questions. And this is something that I think every project would benefit from, because sometimes we get into the weeds and the details of issues and contracts and start negotiating contracts, and we haven't answered the fundamental questions. Does the country actually need the nuclear power plant? Because sometimes the answer is not really. And sometimes it is, yes, they absolutely need it, right? So that enhances the position. So we are in a corner now. The industry is turning a corner. One thing that we have is the Gen 3+ reactors are currently in operation. After many, many years of delays and issues, they're operating. They work great. Now they can be replicated. Fantastic. So keep building them. Same supply chain, same models. There's no reason why we shouldn't be building more of these today. There's increasing number of technology providers from around the world, which is good. There's a lot of availability of technologies, good technologies. And we are getting much closer to the commercialization of SMRs, which is a huge game changer that we didn't see, even 4 or 5 years ago. But at the same time, one thing that you want to do is to profile projects and see the ones that had no problems or limited problems, and learn from them. You know, you can look at the UAE and Baraka project, and we can see all the great things that they did there, and you can learn a lot. I mean, everybody who's doing a nuclear project today should be looking at that project and just say, why do they make this decision? How do they make this decision? What do they do? A lot of great lessons learned. Could there be things that could improve? Of course there are. Learn from those and just say, okay, what is it that we would have done better now, knowing what we know today? So profiling all these projects and understanding what went wrong in Olkiluoto in Finland, what went right in Baraka, what went wrong in other places is very, very important, because the information is out there, and I've seen it happen where we keep repeating the same mistakes. So this is something that's important. So developing a new nuclear power plant is a complex task. It should be undertaken with clear host government policy and mechanisms of government support. Financing is a primary challenge. That's why you need to think about these things really early on. Making use of the IAEA guidance on nuclear power infrastructure development, the milestones, the in-year review process, all these things are extremely helpful. There is an abundance of knowledge in that organization, and I think everybody should be absorbing that, and this is very helpful for a lot of projects. And then successful projects have occurred and are possible. You know, I think that fundamentally we can have great projects. We need significant level of commitment by all parties, the right project partners, experienced and committed and inspired advisors. And I mean that in a way that is in a supporting role. Advisors are not there to take decisions, they're there to advise. And the sovereign, the state-owned entities, the utilities are the ones that should be making the decisions. As I said before, taking full account of all lessons learned and looking at the long-term view for holistic view of success. And the last thing that I must say is with the right leadership. And I've seen this happen over and over again. You know, when some of these very experienced project managers, the first thing they ask is like, who's leading this? Can you tell me that one person who's leading this? And that is fundamentally important. You need to have that clear leader who's going to be taking forward the project no matter what. And in most successful projects that I've worked on, I've seen it, I can always point to one person that is the real leader of that project. And I think it's fundamentally important to have that leader in any nuclear project. So looking at the project from the point of view of the sponsors, of the lenders, the vendors, the public, the government, the suppliers, all coming together to a common interest is really important for the fundamentals of developing and financing a nuclear power plant. And that's the end of my slides, and thank you very much.
Много благодаря, Джордж. Наистина много ценни съвети. За щастие от примера с разговорите с търговската банка, която е достигнала до нея възможността да участва в финансиране, много от въпросите в нашия частен случай в България смятам, че имаме утвърдителен отговор, строго положителен. Имаме ли нужда? Да, имаме нужда. Да, обществото подкрепя ли? Да, си подкрепя. Имаме ли капацитет да експлоатираме? Да, имаме близо 50 годишна история. Сега ни остава като индустрия само малката задача да успеем да убедим и държавата, че трябва да си влезе в ролята, да промени това отношение, което се наблюдава наистина новаторско е последните години и Юлиан го спомена, но ние не искаме да сме ангажирани, хем от една страна, от друга страна тук се намесва и нещо друго чисто българско. Всеки изпълнител е престъпник до доказване на противното, така че много трудно може да се стигне до това партньорство истинско през целия живот на проекта, но ще намерим начин да се справим.
Петре, ако ми разрешиш, аз си отбелязах 3 точки от това, което Джордж говори. Едното беше определението за развитие на човешки ресурси като long lead item, т.е. като актив, който изисква дългосрочно развитие, нещо, което обсъждахме в предишния вебинар. Той също спомена, което и ти спомена, необходимостта от ясна политика в тази област на държавно ниво, нещо, което често излиза в тези вебинари. отсъствието на енергийна стратегия, която към момента всъщност я няма. Тя последната валидна изтече преди 2 години. И последната точка, която си отбелязах, е лидерството. Ключов въпрос за такива големи проекти. Обратно към тебе, Петре.
Да, благодаря за допълнението, Милко. Само още един въпрос набързо към Джордж. Все пак променя се, стана дума, че един финансов инвеститор традиционно гледа много простичко на нещата, приходите, откъде ще дойдат тази електроенергия, ще произвеждаме, добре, как ще я продаваме, за колко ще я продаваме, колко ще произвеждаме. Но все пак последните години до голяма степен в резултат от осъзнаването на нуждата за действие посока на климатичните изменения се появява и доста, както го наричат, програмно инвестиране. В този смисъл стана дума сега и как и войната в Украйна ни провокира да мислиме за някои други атрибути, освен чисто производителност и икономическа целесъобразност, като сигурност на доставките, но кои други ключови атрибути по отношение на environmental, social и governance критериите можем да споменем, що се касае ядрената енергетика?
Absolutely. I think that, first of all, on the ESG front, that when you look at nuclear, one of the great advantages, and I don't think that we as an industry make a good point of pointing that out, is that it's compact. It has a lot of energy, which means you need less land, you need less materials. And that is a huge thing when you're looking about sustainability, right? You know, when you're looking at how much land you need in order to put a nuclear power plant compared to renewables, how many materials you need. It is quite impressive and the huge spread. I think this is one of the key things that nuclear has an advantage, the fact that it's such dense energy and you require so little of materials in order to produce all that energy. So I think the other points on the ESG side that are worth always pointing out is that you have low volumes of waste, very, very low volumes of waste compared to other forms of energy. You have, it's a highly regulated industry, so there's a lot of accountability on everything that's happening on the production, on the materials, on the waste, on security. So again, there is a social aspect. These are inherently safe places where you have demonstrably very safe operations. We have one of the lowest death rates in any kind of industry, especially in the energy industry. And that is something that we should be talking about and shouldn't be shying away because, you know, the perception is completely different than the reality. And this is something we should always be talking about. And the other thing that is important, especially for developing countries, is the fact that it helps develop society. You see societies that flourish with nuclear, they flourish with the development, not only because of the abundance of energy and electricity that comes with it, but also it creates communities, it creates high-paying jobs, highly respected jobs, a lot of engineering jobs. So these are all things that help with the development of a nuclear project and to show that there are society-wide benefits that investors should be looking at from an ESG point of view as well.
Да, благодаря. Трябва да помним, че устойчивост не значи само липса или ниски въглеродни емисии, ами трябва да се гледа цялостно и върху целия жизнен цикъл. И така смятам да преминем към господин Мишел Бартелеми, тъй като благодарение на тази голяма плътност на енергията, която ядрената технология ни позволява да оползотворим, е и нещо, което един аспект, който често се дебатира, но за всички в индустрията се призната, това е ниската или като минимум много устойчива себестойност на електроенергията произведена от ядрени инсталации. Nuclear Energy Agency има една публикация, прогнозни себестойности на електроенергия от различни производства. Според последните анализи, какво е заключението, господин Бартелеми? Продължава ли да е конкурентно способна по този критерий ядрената енергетика?
Well, thank you very much and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be speaking at today's Bulgaria event. Especially very nice for us to speak at this event because as you know, and as has been noted in the introduction, Bulgaria is 1st of January of last year, so it's very nice.
Michelle, we lost you.
Okay. So
would you mind switching off your camera because your voice is? I mean, the bandwidth is not very great.
Yes, that will allow me to get closer to the window. So whenever the conversation broke, I was about to say that it was very nice to speak today, and noted that Bulgaria is the latest member of the NEA since last year. So once again, welcoming you as part of the NEA family, and now I was coming to apologize because we actually are facing today a power cut in the office. I've been just told I'm supposed to leave the office, and so if you allow me, I'm going to stay until the end of my presentation, and there I might leave a few minutes early so that I don't get in trouble. And I had also prepared a couple of slides which I can't deliver to you because my email address doesn't work currently as our servers are down. However, I have them in front of me, so I'll be able to share some key insights with you, and I will make sure that I provide you the slide as soon as we resume some normal activity here. I was going to talk today about our recent NEA work on the cost and competitiveness of nuclear power. And when we look at this issue at NEA, our starting point is to try to understand what cost we need to take into account to assess the competitiveness of nuclear power. And most often when people discuss cost of nuclear versus renewable versus gas, the conversation tends to focus at the plant level, in particular talking about the levelized cost of electricity. But it doesn't really look at the system level impact, and in particular, we tend to overlook still till this day some of the system costs that are related to integrating viable renewables into the mix, and some of our findings, and I will come back to that later at NEA, is that this cost, as we aim for higher level, a very ambitious level of decarbonization in the decades to come, can become very significant and can be quite central to really understand what is the long-term competitiveness of nuclear power in a carbon-constant world. In addition to that, the additional layer we also consider at NEA is what we call full cost of electricity, and that's looking at a range of what economists call externality, which are not, directly captured in cost and prices. And when we look at the energy sector today, of course, issues such as security of energy supply is top of mind, and these are areas alongside some of the environmental attributes that George was mentioning, where nuclear attributes also will need to be factored in to really have the most comprehensive view on the competitiveness of nuclear power. But for today, I will focus on the first two parts, that is the plant level, levelized cost of electricity, and the system level analysis.
at the plant level, we publish at NEA every 5 years with our colleagues from the International Energy Agency a report on projected cost of generating electricity, where we apply a standard methodology homogenized among our member countries to project the cost of generating electricity over the next 5 to 10 years. The last report is from 2020, and a few insights comes from that, which I think are worth mentioning to start frame this conversation. The first one is when we look at cost of low carbon sources of electricity, we see that, of course, the cost of variable renewable has decreased significantly in recent years, but we see that when it comes to nuclear, it's important to keep in mind that we have existing nuclear power plants and that the long-term operation of existing nuclear power plants still to this day comes out as the most competitive source of low carbon electricity on a levelized cost basis. That doesn't mean that markets will necessarily value this source of electricity. In particular, we see issues with some of the US markets due to very low gas prices. But putting that aside, overall, on a cost basis, nuclear power compared to variable renewable, existing nuclear power can be very and continue to be very competitive. When it comes to new nuclear, we see that we see in particular, we see from previous exercise of this report, looking at the last 3 or 4 editions, that clearly over the last couple of decades there has been there has been increases in the cost of nuclear new builds. This is very much reflected in our data. But the interesting point to note is that compared to the previous edition, we start now to see the beginning of a reduction in the cost of nuclear new build. And for us, we very much attribute that to the fact that we are turning the page from the construction of first of a kind projects and align with some of the points that George has made, as much as we are able to learn lessons from this project and to replicate this design and to not build again first of a kind reactors, which of course then links to a number of issues around standardization and harmonization. We see that nuclear power is very much in position to start its own cost reduction curve, new nuclear, to start its own cost reduction curve as it was the case for variable renewable over the last decade. I apologize for the people speaking in the background, reminding me that I'm still supposed to leave this building. Now, having said that, in the levelized cost of electricity, there's a number of parameters that play out. And one of the key parameters, of course, is the assumption you will make on the cost of capital. In a levelized cost of electricity spreadsheet, you will call that the discount factor, but just for the sake of the argument, I'm going to talk about the cost of capital. And of course, then what we see is that at the current level of the cost of nuclear new build, which on average for OECD country range around a bit below 5,000 euros per kilowatt electric, we see that cost of capital, that mean to say financial condition, is going to be today what will determine the competitiveness of nuclear power at the plant level compared to variable renewable. And this is very much why today's conversation on financing is very much central to address this issue. And again, as George was saying, this is behind that the conversation that needs to be had is on how we think about allocating risk for a project, because this is what will eventually be factored in the cost of capital. So this is a landscape at the plant level. When we go at the system level, things are are more complicated. But without any slide, I think I can still relate to you some of the key findings from our work. First, allow me to explain a bit what we mean about system cost of electricity. We essentially mean cost above the plant level required to integrate a given technology to the electricity system. And I mean that every technology will have some system cost, because every technology will need to be integrated to various extent. The question is, for which technology do these costs become so significant that not talking about them provide a very distorted picture of the competitiveness. In particular, this cost, the system cost at the grid level, we can break them down into three parts. First, there is what we call profile cost, and by profile cost, we essentially means the cost of backup, so that we can manage variability and or intermittency, which of course you can quickly see that when it comes to viable renewable is to this day still a central issue. In addition to profile cost, there is what we call balancing cost, which essentially captures the fact that, especially for viable renewable, with still a higher level of uncertainty in terms of generation profile, which means that the given system will need to have more margins. And this also lead to system cost. And third, and last but not least, there will also be cost for the electricity grid, for transmission and distribution, because renewable will tend to be more spread across a given territory or space, and being more distributed will require high cost for the grid, which as we move to higher share of renewable is also something which can become significant. We've published a number of reports on this field that provide some high-level assessment of the system cost of electricity. Our latest flagship report was from 2019. Some of the key results from that is, as we move to a scenario with the share of nuclear increasing, in particular up to 75% of viable renewables, we see that the system cost can become significant. We see that they grow with the increase as the share of viable renewable grows. And when we reach 75% of viable renewable in the mix, these can amount to up to $40 per megawatt hour. And so they can become of the same order of magnitude than some of the plant level costs. So it's very much essential that we look at them, that we factor them in whenever we discuss the competitiveness of electricity technologies, and we see that once we do that, the competitiveness of nuclear power is very much strengthened and becomes quite obvious. The last point I wanted to conclude upon is on how this system cost of electricity can evolve with time. Some of the results I was presenting below before were for a carbon constraint of 50 grams of CO2 per megawatt hour, which is roughly the level of the French electricity grid today, for instance. So it's a fairly decarbonized electricity system, but it is not zero. If our goal, central climate and energy policy goal is to reach net zero, we need again to talk about the system cost and how not only they can increase with the share of viable renewables, but how adding the dimension of the carbon constraints and moving from 50 grams to 0 grams can lead to what we are almost tempted to call a system cost cliff. And I have a very nice 3D graph that I was aiming to show you, and I will make sure you get it as soon as get back power and internet. And what we see is one can chart a path which is still, which where the cost increase, but are still manageable to get to 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. But if we decide to rely mostly on variable renewable, then moving from 50 grams to 0 grams can become unmanageable, because you're going to be faced with a cliff. And we see that in this case, the last gram of CO2 are really areas where the value of nuclear increased immensely. And so, putting this in the context of European policy objectives, we clearly, clearly see that relying predominantly on variable renewable for, let's say, reaching 2030 climate goals can really put one in a position where meeting the 2050 net zero goal can become extremely challenging, if not unfeasible. And the issue, of course, going back to the nuclear sector and to the timeline of developing nuclear projects is that what will be possible from today to 2050 to chart a path if before going nuclear up to 2030, and what we realize that it is a structural role to reach the 50 goals. Well, it might just be too late, and it might just be that we miss our climate goals because we started on the wrong path. So of course, in today's increasingly complex energy and geopolitical world, more than ever, it's important to really understand the value that nuclear power can provide to society to meet these climate goals and other energy policy objectives. So with that, I'll stop. And nobody has come to take me away, so I'll be very happy to answer any questions, follow-up you may have.
Okay. Благодаря. Благодаря на Мишел Бартелеми. Разбирам проблемите, които имаше с прекъсването на електроенергията в неговия офис и се надявам, че това е плод на някои от летните бури като следствие от промените на климата, а не от липса на премислена политика за сигурност на доставки предварително. Няма да развивам тази тема повече. Благодаря, Мишел. Чакаме твоите слайдове, за да може да ги споделим с присъстващите и най-вече линкове към двата доклада, за които ти говори, които са много полезни и мисля, че аудиторията ще има полза от това да ги прочете. Сега преминаваме към разговор с Алиша Денкър, председател на Международната рамкова организация за сътрудничество в областта на ядрената енергетика. ИФНЕК е много активна, особено с страните, които развиват ядрената енергетика, но също така, които за пръв път започват развитие на свои ядрени програми. И в серия от вебинари през миналата година осветлиха много въпроси, свързани с таксономията, с финансиране на ядрени проекти, с новите ядрени технологии, като малки модулни реактори. И да започнем разговора, Алиша, какво ядрената енергетика банкируема ли е? Може ли да бъде финансирана? Какви са изводите от тези, от диалога и от работата на ИФНЕК? Благодаря.
Well, thank you, Milko, for having me today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm very honored to join this very distinguished panel and also to come after Berta, George, Michel, because they laid such a nice foundation for a response to your question. I'd say a very short answer, yes, absolutely, and we're excited about it. Nuclear is bankable and financeable. But obviously, there are many challenges, as those who have spoken before me have laid out. And from the IFNEC perspective, financing is something that we have been talking about for more than a decade. Literally, it was in London in 2012 that we held a financing workshop. And here we are in 2022, still struggling with the challenges of financing nuclear projects. And we have had the very best, to include George and others, help us with this throughout our decade of trying. And I would say we've definitely made progress. We've learned a lot about what we need to have in place, but still we have challenges. And Berta has outlined one that we are all paying attention to and recognizing, just like a nuclear accident, nuclear financing affects everyone, and the taxonomy of nuclear affects everyone. And so it's something that I don't consider a problem or issue or challenge just for the European Union and the countries that are members, but also globally, because all of us have to be advocating for the nuclear financing and all of the flexibilities that need to come with that. So let me tell you a bit about what IFNEC has been doing. IFNEC is a 65-member country organization, and it has the shared mission of making sure that nuclear is used in a safe, secure, and peaceful manner with the highest standards of safety, security, and non-proliferation. We have had webinars, meetings, conferences, published reports, and still we face challenges. Now, IFNEC's membership is very diverse. We have countries who do not choose to deploy nuclear, those who have very advanced nuclear projects, but still we all understand that nuclear, being a global source of nuclear energy, must be important to all of us because it will affect all of us, whether we're deploying it or not. So the countries have been thinking about the various concerns that they face, many of which George has already laid out very nicely, and what they need to prepare themselves to do to be able to successfully finance a project. Now, SMRs being introduced into this mix will alleviate some of these challenges, but yet present new and other different challenges. So the concerns that they've looked at are the long construction periods, the high capital costs, the regulatory uncertainty, reputational risk, which George spelled out very nicely, human resources, first of a kind risk, safety culture, operational success, supply chain, stability of the government, and that cannot be stressed enough, as well as the commitment of the government and how we have that last through various political parties, fuel cycle concerns, environmental responsibilities, and the commitment to liability regimes. And so therefore, we think about all of those challenges, and just one alone would be something that would require a dedicated team to have solutions. So thinking about all of these things at one time and trying to make sure that all are aligned and supported can be a huge challenge. And one thing I think that countries don't think about enough, and we don't discuss enough, is the fact that all of these challenges make up the holistic determination of an export credit agency's review. And so it's not just the credit score of the country or its ability for the government to provide financing or all of the money things that people think about when they think about money. Because when financing is considered, the export credit agency wants to see the whole picture. And sometimes countries have not thought far enough, planned far enough to make sure that they can present a holistic picture. And those things that even internally in a government, with most governments having multiple agencies that are involved in nuclear and nuclear projects, to include the finance agency, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that will work with the other countries, the energy agency. So therefore, trying to organize all of these things, the parliament, which is in some countries equivalent to their Congress, all of these things, changes in ministers, changes in administrations, unanticipated changes in political leadership. So when we look at all of these things, just the political piece of it alone can be one that can be very difficult. But folks don't really think about the direct connection those things have to an ability for a project to be financed. So I think it's important when we answer a question like, can it be done? It can, but we need to make sure that we have all of those stars aligned for that to be able to happen. And since most of the members of IFNEC are government officials, we have focused on the issues that they face. And so the challenges that they try to manage, those that I've just mentioned, play into the work that we try to do to be able to figure out how to manage those different pieces and still move forward with relationships and hopefully projects that can happen. So I think that some of the other internal challenges that go towards that, and George highlighted it, and I so appreciate the human capacity. That is very much a long lead item. We hear companies, get very anxious about the long lead items they have to order. Well, governments need to be very anxious about the long lead items they have to make sure are organized, trained, educated, and paid properly so that they do not lose their resources. We find that just being able to retain regulators in many countries is a huge challenge. If you don't have a strong regulatory body, because you don't have enough people to do what you need to do, because you continue to lose your people to other countries who pay much more, or you cannot get people to take the jobs, it will directly affect the ability to finance a project, because it's going to be viewed as that your regulator is not strong. And so I think folks need to really, really look at all of the pieces that go into the puzzle. And I will say that the regulatory capacity is probably one of the top 3 challenges that countries are facing today. And there needs to be a focus and solution on that. And I think working together collectively to provide surge support to trained professionals would be a great option for regional support. We've talked about the issues in the Ukraine and how they have now elevated as a top priority energy security. We've spent a lot of time talking about climate and decarbonization, but we now see, and even a country like the United States is experiencing the same challenges, where there was a dependence on fuel provided by Russia. And those countries in Central and Eastern Europe also were dependent upon services, components, maintenance, all of that for the longevity of their current reactor fleet. So now we are faced with, there's this decarbonization challenge that we were working steadily towards, but now our need has skyrocketed to be able to energize nuclear in a way that we did not have before. Yes, we've made climate goals, but there's a huge difference in importance when we look at energy security, because our energy security is directly tied to our national security. And when all of us are having these same challenges around the globe, then we have a global situation that we have to address together. And so that makes this more important now than ever before, that we mobilize around all of the pieces that are affecting the financing of nuclear projects. Everybody needs to be concerned about this taxonomy issue. Everybody needs to be concerned about making sure that we pay attention to technology transfer issues and liability regimes that countries need to have in place, even on the back end, that we're able to answer all of these questions. I think most importantly, the involvement of the government, which has also been stressed, is more important now than ever. because we have focused on bilateral relationships previously. We don't have bilateral problems anymore. We have multilateral problems, and all of us need to be involved in the solution set. And that's why IFNEC has been a place where we can leverage our relationships that we already have to be able to work together to solve some joint problems. Just to give you an example on the fuel piece with Central and Eastern Europe and just focusing on their needs, we've had conversations that have extended well beyond to players you would not think. Canada, the US, the UK, Japan, Korea, countries in that list I named that you might not think would have worked together before. But all of us are coming together to solve a common problem for our friends in Central and Eastern Europe. And so when we think about what a multilateral forum like IFNEC can do, the NEA can do, the IAEA can do, the IEA can do, and many others, it's very important that we think now about partnership, because it's the partnership that's really going to be able to get us where we need to go, because we need to move faster. And the only way to do that is to do so in numbers. And so I just stress that having a holistic approach and a holistic solution set with a group of people that are like-minded can move things together a lot faster. And I believe that IFNEC and other fora like that are the way to achieve those things. And finally, I'd just like to close with stressing the importance of collaboration within those multilateral organizations as well, and leveraging those synergies. We have a lot to do. I don't think we've been in a situation as dire as this one, with an active war and looking at how we move to manage a war and look ahead to recovery and resilience. So I just stress the importance of partnership and working together, because we are going to have to do that if we're going to be successful. I'll conclude my remarks here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Благодаря на Алиша Дънкън. Очевидно България, след като влезе в ядрената агенция на ОИСР миналата година, е време да погледне и дали не е време да се присъедини към ИФНЕК. Изглежда, че сме пропуснали тази възможност за сътрудничество, за партньорство, както беше представено от председателя на ИФНЕК Алиша Дънкън. Мисля, че бяха подчертани множество важни въпроси. Това, че в сферата на финансирането всеки един проект е обект също така на преглед от финансовите институции, освен от регулаторните национални институции. Важността на националните регулатори, важността на техния капацитет беше обсъждано в предходния вебинар. Мисля, че с няколкото важни бележки, които бяха представени, това допълва картината, която вече се оформя за България. И несъмнено отново стигаме до това, че енергийната политика се прави от държавата и е необходимо дългосрочен хоризонт за всички начинания и постигане на целите на енергийната политика. Благодаря. Аз искам да благодаря много за търпението на Елина Теплински, която беше с нас през цялото време. Елина е също така човек ангажиран в множество международни проекти с Пилсбъри, нейната компания, правна компания. И мен ми се иска, Елина, ако можеш в допълнение на това, което беше казано, ти следиш развитието около таксономията много отблизо. Какво е състоянието, какво е очакването ти за гласуването в началото на месец юли в парламента? И доколко всъщност има алтернативни начини на финансиране на атомни проекти, доколко примерно може да бъдат използвани пенсионните фондове за финансиране на проекти, важността на ESG при финансиране на ядрени проекти. Въобще, ако може даже да някои заключения от това, което чу до момента, да предложиш на аудиторията, ще бъда благодарен. Елина, имаш думата.
Absolutely. And can you hear me okay, Milko?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm doing double duty because I'm also participating in an IEA workshop at the moment. So not exactly in an office type of location, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this really interesting discussion. As far as the taxonomy, in my view, this has been, of course, a very long saga, as Berta has summarized very well. And the taxonomy, by its definition, is supposed to be a science-based process. It's very clear that despite the very favorable conclusions of 3 different scientific bodies, that nuclear is in fact sustainable and does no significant harm to the environment, there remains to be opposition to including nuclear in the taxonomy. And in a way, from a lawyer's point of view, if you looked at the regulation, nuclear was set out to fail in some ways from the start, because the definition of sustainable was expressly linked to renewable. So nuclear, even in its inclusion, is going to be included, as a transition technology, not the expressly sustainable technology, which is of course better than being excluded altogether. If I had a crystal ball, I think based on the number of MEPs in different countries that are going to be voting on this, I think there's a pretty good chance that the complementary delegated act will be supported, it will not be opposed, and it will pass. So I do think that we have a pretty good chance of seeing nuclear included in a way that has been included as a transition technology, which is also very strange, right? Because if you read the complementary act, it expressly acknowledges the importance of nuclear in the energy transition and operating well beyond 2050, especially with advanced reactors. So it almost doesn't fit the definition of transition technology anyway, which underscores, how fraught with difficulties this process has been. I do think that it's important to understand, we of course all want nuclear to be included in taxonomy, and the taxonomy is important. It cannot be disregarded. But in some ways, if you look at the global movement towards deep decarbonization, if you look at what's happened in the past 4 years, I think starting with the 2018 IPCC report, there is simply a growing recognition outside of the few countries that are just very expressly anti-nuclear, that deep decarbonization is going to require all clean sources of energy. And I think there's a false equivalency sometimes with energy transition being equivalent to electrification. And that's a narrative that's pushed by certain segments of society, but that's not in fact the case. Right, not at all. Only about 25% of the economy that needs to be decarbonized is something that can be easily electrified. The rest is really not the power sector. We're looking at transportation, we're looking at industry, for example, steel production, cement production. We're looking at buildings, right? Heating buildings and cooling buildings. Most of this cannot be electrified. So in addition to all of the sources of energy, clean energy that we'll need for the power sector, we also need clean sources of energy and heat, like nuclear power, to decarbonize the 75% that's left. And for that reason, I think that whatever the decision of the taxonomy will be, positive or not, or sort of in a gray area, halfway positive, halfway not exactly what we want, really the industrials around the world, the large companies, whatever their public messaging may be, are looking at the situation much more realistically. They're looking at to see where they can get those sources of electricity and heat. And yes, there's a reporting mechanism under the taxonomy where pension funds and other types of investors, they'll have to report which activities are expressed as sustainable, which are transitional, and which are not, and that will have some influence. But I think ultimately, when it comes to real investors that need the energy in order to decarbonize. And if you look at, the Fortune 500, you look at all of these companies, there are these ESG goals that they've set out for themselves, independent in some ways of of pressure from the outside, whether it's government or investors. They have very aggressive ESG goals. And the reality is going to hit, and it has already hit, I think, many of these companies, that the 100% renewables route is not going to work. Natural gas with CCUS will be important, but is not sufficient. And we see now the issues, of course, with natural gas in Europe as well. So nuclear essentially will be necessary, whether it is heralded as being sustainable from a taxonomy viewpoint or not. And I think if you look especially outside of Europe, the movement is very much, if you heard of the statements and kind of what was happening in the background at COP26, and I'm sure it's going to be the same in COP27, I think nuclear has been accepted by now as part of the deep decarbonization movement and the energy transition. So I think that's going to be important regardless of the results of the taxonomy. One thing I wanted to mention, I think you wanted me to address this, Milk, on multilateral institutions and
Yes.
financing. This is the one remaining piece that we still need to tackle. So if you look at the amount of funding that is available from multilateral banks and international finance institutions, it's about $300 billion a year. The issue we have with nuclear projects, even if some of the proposals in Europe are successful, there's still sort of a drop in the bucket, right? If we're talking about one project in Bulgaria, one project in Romania, one project in the UK, that's not what is really needed in order to support the energy transition. And even if those projects, as George has outlined, are perfectly structured and there's appropriate government support, there still needs to be a significant amount of funding that governments aren't going to be able to put in on a unilateral basis, and investors aren't going to be able to come up with, on the scale that's really needed. And that's where I think multilateral banks really have the opportunity to come in. As of today, most of them have very aggressive climate change targets. As of 2020, all of the multilaterals have stopped funding coal. Natural gas and other fossils, that's kind of a bank by bank policy. They're all looking at renewables, but nuclear is still not on the table, with exception of the EIB, which has a pro-nuclear policy, but hasn't actually financed any nuclear, at least recently. And there is precedent. The EBRD had financed significant amounts of nuclear in the EU. And when we looked at, we just did a project actually for the NEA that I'm presenting next week. When we looked at the reasons behind this, some of it is anti-nuclear sentiment and the sort of lack of understanding, but most of it is lack of technical prowess at the banks in order to even try to understand what nuclear is and how to finance it. So because of this, one needs to be a recognition that nuclear is part, it has to be part of these climate change strategies, and resources need to be dedicated to establishing capacity at these banks to look at nuclear projects and finance them. But at the same time, there needs to be a new instrument. And quite a few of us, including you and George and others, are working on this new concept of the International Bank for Nuclear Infrastructure, which is a conceptual new multilateral international finance institution that would focus solely on supporting new nuclear development, as well as nuclear fuel cycle, and long-term life extensions for existing nuclear. And that bank will solve some of this issue, some of the issues that we see with the existing MDBs of not having the technical capacity to understand nuclear. At the same time, it would also establish standards that would be used to evaluate projects and would make them more attractive to some of the other investors, some of the private investors as well. So that's another mechanism. And I think I can summarize this discussion by saying, the problem is very big. in order for nuclear to be part of that, you need lots of solutions. It's not a single solution. It's not just the government coming in and putting in a framework for a nuclear project. It's not just the project participants putting together the right structure and making it bankable, but you need multilateral engagement. You need alternative financing to come in from industry that's going to need nuclear in order to meet its decarbonization goals. So these are all of the things that we have to tackle. And I think it's very much will apply to Bulgaria, that it's not, there's no silver bullet. Lots of different mechanisms have to come together to make this a reality.
Благодаря, Елина, за интересните идеи, нови идеи, по които се работи, включително за многостранна банка в областта на развитието на инфраструктурата. Един от последните документи, в които бях въвлечен, докато работех в Международната агенция по атомна енергия, се казва изисквания към ресурсите по развитие на ядрената инфраструктура. Документът излезе наскоро, беше в Resource Requirements, се нарича на английски. Излезе от публикация и там от опита на страните членки развитието на необходимите правна, регулаторна, институционална среда, човешки ресурси са значителни, за да се развие един ядрен проект. Могат да бъдат оценени на нивото на около половин милиард, когато една страна започва да развива своята програма. И несъмнено всички тези нужди трябва да се балансират с ползите от ядрената енергетика, които бяха подчертани от множество от говорившите. Един изключително концентриран, високо безопасен източник на ниско въглеродна енергия, който е част от всички научни изследвания, свързани с управлението на климата и преодоляването на тази криза. Определено ядрената енергетика излезе отново като първи източник в списъка на енергийните източници от гледна точка на сигурност на енергийни доставки и, както някой каза, енергийната сигурност е част от националната сигурност. Днес несъмнено има нови предизвикателства. Войната в Украйна е едно такова и много дълготрайни връзки, които бяха така изградени, взаимна зависимост, днес вече са немислими. Т.е. трябва бързи, съгласувани решения за решаването на тези големи глобални проблеми. С това аз искам да благодаря изключително много на нашите панелисти. Не виждам да има въпроси от... извинявайте. Има въпроси от... така... да. Има един въпрос неопределен. Той е дали ще има възможност за дискусия с обикновените потребители на електроенергия. Очаквам вашите въпроси да бъдат зададени в чата, както е по условията на този семинар. И ако искате, ще ви отговорим в писмена форма. Има коментар от професор Янко Янев, който коментира много от нещата, които се говориха на този вебинар, като подчертава важността на научната основа при взимане на политически и икономически решения и значението на знанията, натрупани от хората при такива решения. Тоест, доколко всички решения в областта на икономиката и политиката се взимат на рационална основа. Това е сложен философски въпрос, дали ще можем да му отговорим днес. Искам да уведомя всички присъстващи, че презентацията, слайдовете, които Джордж Борова сподели с нас, ще бъдат на разположение. Също така Мишел Бартелеми ще сподели слайдовете, които искаше да представи, но по технически причини не успя. С това искам да попитам организаторите и председателя на Булатом, господин Манчев и господин Станислав Георгиев, за заключителни думи по цялата серия от семинари, които приключват с този. Това е четвъртият подред. Господин Георгиев, господин Манчев.
Аз няколко думи ще кажа по всичките тези теми, особено по последната. В света много рязко се смениха условията на финансиране на дадени проекти от тежките изисквания, които се налагат, за да решиме да стигнем до 50-та година да живеем в чист свят. Няма нищо общо с това, което се случваше от преди 5 години, когато света смяташе, че има безкрайно голямо количество въглеводород, наречен природен газ, и може да се построи колко си искат централи, и затова ядрената енергетика с нейния голям проблем за дългото строителство и многото капиталовложение, които са банките, го разглеждаха като един не много привлекателен строителен обект. Това нещо се промени рязко, защото ядрената енергетика е най-ниско въглеродния източник и най-устойчивия към момента. Може би не е най-добрия, но за сега по-добър от него нямаме, ако искаме да имаме устойчив преход към беземисионна икономика в света, за да живеем в чист и по-дълговечен свят. Това е, което искам да кажа, и може би всички финансови институции, юристи, агенции трябва сериозно да помислят, за да помогнат този процес да стане по-лесен. Без държавите, на които територии се строят централите, това не може да бъде. И политическата класа в цял свят е длъжна на своите народи, където се строят тези централи, че трябва да обърне много по-сериозно внимание, за да се случат те и те да помогнат на развитието. Аз привеждам пример само нашата държава, че ние, нашето виждане, булатно, това, което сме развивали, и на тая база сме направили тези 4 вебинара, стигайки 50-та година с 4000 мегавата нови мощности, които да са построени на двете площадки, ще позволят на България да изгради като надстройка огромно количество ВЕИ-та, 10 хиляди мегавата солари, 2000 мегавата вятър да направим и не по-малко 2000 мегавата парогазови централи, които работят с смесено гориво, водород и природен газ. Тегловите единици са 30% на 70%, с висок коефициент на полезно действие 62%. Това е, което може да ни позволи да си решим беземисионната икономика и в транспорта, и в енергетиката, и в тежката химия, и металургията, която работи. Много съм удовлетворен от това, което успяхме да постигнем и да обърнем внимание и да го изнесеме към обществеността всичките тези въпроси. Надявам се на всичките тези хора, които са се включвали по някакъв начин, да бъдат по-активни, да ни зададат много въпроси, на които ние ще се постараем да отговорим, защото това е смисъл на нашите вебинари, да имаме обратната връзка и да разшириме познанията колкото можем. Благодаря ви.
Благодаря. Аз съжалявам, че не предупредих, но мисля, че в съобщението това беше казано. Вебинарът е записан, той ще бъде изложен на страницата на Булатом, като всички участници, ако зададат писмени въпроси, организаторите ще потърсят съответните отговори на тях. С това искам да благодаря на панелистите за тяхното време, на Форатом или Nuclear Europe, както се казва сега, на IFNEC, на NEA, на Хантън, на Пилсбъри и на Юлиан. Юлиан, не съжалявам, не знам къде си, но ти сам по себе си институция. Благодаря и до нови срещи.
Довиждане, до нови срещи.